Metrojet Flight 9268, an international charter flight operated by an Airbus, Station 231, carried 224 people, including 217 passengers and 7 crew members, when tragedy struck on October 31, 2015. Shortly after departing from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, bound for St. Petersburg, Russia, the aircraft suddenly vanished from radar screens. Moments later, it exploded mid-air over the northern Sinai Peninsula. Wreckage was scattered across nearly 8 square miles. The nose section was found several miles apart from the tail, a clear sign that the jet had broken apart at more than 31,000 feet. The catastrophic breakup was too sudden for any distress call. Russian and Egyptian investigators later confirmed what many had feared, that the crash was the result of a terrorist bombing. Traces of explosives were discovered, and experts concluded that a small improvised explosive device, roughly equivalent to 2.2 pounds of TNT, had detonated during the flight. The claim was soon reinforced by ISIS's Sinai branch, which released images of what it said was the bomb, a simple device hidden inside a soda can. Satellite data from a U.S. infrared system also detected a heat flash consistent with an onboard explosion, while the cockpit voice recorder captured a loud, abrupt noise before going silent. The Airbus itself was 18 years old, with about 56,000 flight hours. Interestingly, it had suffered a tail strike during a landing in Cairo years earlier. Though that was ruled out as a contributing factor, the aftermath was severe. Both the UK and Russia suspended all flights to and from Sharm el-Sheikh, devastating the region's tourism industry. Within months, Metrojet filed for bankruptcy. Russia later offered a $50 million reward for information, leading to those responsible. Metrojet Flight 9268 remains a chilling reminder of how a single act of terror can shatter hundreds of lives and reshape international aviation security forever. On the morning of July 28, 2010, Pakistan awoke to one of its darkest aviation tragedies. Airblue Flight 202, an Airbus IT-1, flying from Karachi to Islamabad, was carrying 152 people when it vanished into the thick clouds above the Margalla Hills. Moments later, it slammed into the mountainside, killing everyone on board. This was the first ever fatal crash involving an Airbus A321 anywhere in the world, making the disaster especially haunting. The weather that morning was harsh, low clouds, heavy rain, and almost zero visibility. While other pilots chose to circle or divert, Captain Pervez Iqbal Chaudhry decided to press on toward Islamabad. Inside the cockpit, things were far from calm. The 61-year-old captain repeatedly scolded and belittled his 34-year-old first officer throughout the flight, creating a toxic atmosphere. The first officer, humiliated and silent, stopped challenging the captain's poor decisions, even as danger loomed ahead. Ignoring air traffic control instructions and multiple ground proximity warnings, the captain misconfigured the autopilot and turned the plane toward the mountains instead of away from them. At just 2,300 feet, alarms blared, but it was too late. The aircraft struck the hills at high speed and burst into flames. Witnesses later recalled seeing the jet flying as low as a 4-story building before impact, followed by an explosion that lit up the cloudy sky. Rescue teams rushed to the site, climbing the steep terrain and digging through wreckage with bare hands. No survivors were found. Each victim's family was compensated, and in a symbolic tribute, 152 trees were planted, one for every life lost. The final investigation concluded that the cause was controlled flight into terrain, triggered by overconfidence, poor cockpit discipline, and a total breakdown of teamwork. Airblue Flight 202 stands as a painful reminder that in aviation, even the most advanced aircraft cannot save a crew blinded by ego and misjudgment. On the night of January 28, 2025, chaos erupted inside Gimhae International Airport in Busan, South Korea. Air Busan Flight 391, an Airbus A321 carrying 176 people, was preparing for departure to Hong Kong after a short delay. As the aircraft sat on the taxiway, passengers suddenly heard a faint crackling sound near an overhead bin. Within moments, smoke began pouring out, followed by bright orange flames. Panic spread through the cabin. The fire originated from a portable power bank that had overheated and exploded inside the overhead. compartment. Flight attendants rushed to extinguish the blaze, but the fire spread too quickly through nearby luggage. Passengers coughed as thick smoke filled the aisle, some shouting and trying to open overhead bins while others struggled to breathe. Crew members gave conflicting instructions. Some passengers were told to stay seated even as the fire grew worse. Finally, an emergency evacuation was ordered. The doors burst open and inflatable slides deployed as terrified passengers escaped into the cold night air. All 176 occupants survived, but 27 were injured, mostly from smoke inhalation or while sliding down to the tarmac. Firefighters battled the blaze for nearly an hour before declaring the A321 a total loss. Investigators traced the source to a faulty power bank whose insulation had degraded, triggering a runaway thermal reaction. In response, the South Korean government imposed strict new safety rules. From March 1, 2025, no airline in the country could allow portable chargers or e-cigarettes inside overhead bins, and charging devices during flight was banned. Passengers were limited to 5 power banks per person. Though no lives were lost, Air Busan Flight 391 became a powerful reminder of how one tiny device and a battery the size of a wallet can destroy a multi-million-dollar aircraft in minutes. On February 2, 2016, Dalo Airlines Flight 159 took off from Mogadishu, Somalia, with 81 people on board, bound for Djibouti. 20 minutes into the flight, at about 14,000 feet, a sudden explosion ripped through the cabin. A massive hole tore open the fuselage near row 15, sucking in the thin air and blasting debris into the sky. Panic spread instantly. Flight attendants shouted for passengers to move toward the rear of the plane as oxygen masks dropped. The pilots, a 64-year-old Serbian captain and a 24-year-old Italian first officer, stayed remarkably calm. Despite the deafening wind and damaged controls, they managed to turn the aircraft back toward Mogadishu for an emergency landing. Miraculously, 80 people survived. Only one person died, the suspected suicide bomber, whose body was ejected through the hole caused by the explosion. Investigators later confirmed that a bomb hidden inside a laptop had detonated shortly after takeoff. Security footage showed the bomber receiving the laptop from airport staff members before boarding. If the flight hadn't been delayed by 20 minutes, the bomb would have exploded at cruising altitude, likely destroying the aircraft completely. The tragedy exposed shocking flaws in airport security. Somali authorities arrested more than 20 people, including government officials and airline workers. A military court later sentenced 2 masterminds to life in prison. The militant group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility, stating that its real target had been a Turkish Airlines flight canceled earlier that morning. The event shook the aviation world, revealing how fragile safety can be when airport security is compromised. As the captain later said bluntly, "Security is zero, they can put anything inside." Flight 159 stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes survival depends on nothing more than a delay. On August 15, 2019, Ural Airlines Flight 178, an Airbus A321, was preparing for a short morning flight from Moscow-Zhukovsky Airport to Simferopol. Everything seemed normal: clear skies, calm winds, and 233 passengers eager to begin their journey. But within seconds of takeoff, everything changed. Just moments after lifting off the runway, the plane struck a massive flock of seagulls, sending several birds crashing into both engines. The loud thuds were followed by violent vibrations and the sudden loss of thrust. Smoke and the smell of burning filled the cockpit as alarms screamed across the control panel. With both engines failing, Captain Damir Yusupov made a split-second decision. There was no time to return to the airport. Gliding silently just 750 feet above the ground, he aimed for a nearby cornfield. The landing was rough but miraculously controlled. The A321 skidded to a stop, landing gear torn away but the fuselage intact. Incredibly, all 233 people survived. Only a few suffered minor injuries. The event was later called a miracle on the cornfield. The pilots were honored as national heroes, and their composure under pressure became a shining example of skill and calm. Courage in aviation history. On June 10, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390, a BAC 111 jet, took off from Birmingham, England, heading toward Malaga, Spain. There were 81 people on board, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary as the aircraft climbed smoothly through 17,000 feet. But just a few minutes after takeoff, disaster struck in the most terrifying way possible. Without warning, the cockpit windshield exploded outward, tearing free from the frame. The powerful suction of decompression pulled the captain halfway out of the aircraft, leaving him pinned against the outside of the cockpit by 300-mile-per-hour winds. His legs and torso dangled outside as co-pilot. Alistair Atchison struggled to hold control of the aircraft. Cabin crew members rushed in, grabbing the captain's belt and legs to stop him from being completely sucked out. For nearly 20 minutes, they held on as the freezing air roared through the open cockpit. Despite the chaos, Atchison managed to keep the jet steady, descending rapidly for an emergency landing at Southampton Airport. When the aircraft finally touched down safely, passengers erupted in tears and applause. Astonishingly, the captain, Tim Lancaster, survived, suffering only frostbite and minor fractures. Investigators later discovered that the bolts used to replace the windshield were the wrong size, slightly thinner than required, causing the glass to fail under pressure. The accident led to a complete overhaul of aircraft maintenance safety checks. In the UK, it remains one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history, proof that calm teamwork can overcome even the most unthinkable odds. On November 4, 2010, Qantas Flight 32, an Airbus A380, one of the largest passenger aircraft ever built, took off from Singapore's Changi Airport, bound for Sydney, Australia. There were 469 people on board, including some of Qantas's most experienced pilots. The skies were clear and the takeoff seemed perfect, but just 4 minutes later, everything changed. As the massive jet climbed past 7,000 feet, passengers heard a loud bang from the left wing. The cabin shook violently and smoke began pouring from the number 2 engine. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared one after another. More than 50 system failures appeared on the screens. The engine had exploded, sending metal fragments through the wing, damaging wiring, hydraulics, and fuel lines. Captain Richard de Crespigny and his crew faced what experts later called the most complex emergency in aviation history. The A380 had lost major systems, brakes and engine control, yet somehow, the pilots kept their composure. For 2 tense hours, they ran dozens of checklists manually, while the cabin crew reassured terrified passengers. When the plane finally turned back and landed safely in Singapore, its brakes overheated and smoke trailed from the damaged wing, but all 469 lives were saved. Later, investigators found that a small manufacturing flaw in an engine oil pipe caused the explosion, a single crack that nearly destroyed the world's largest passenger jet. Flight 32 became a lesson in calm leadership and the power of teamwork under impossible pressure. As Captain Richard later said, aviate, navigate, communicate, then manage. In that order. On January 15, 2009, an ordinary afternoon flight turned into one of the greatest survival stories in aviation history. U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320, took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. On board were 155 people, 150 passengers and 5 crew. Just 90 seconds after takeoff, while climbing through 3,000 feet, disaster struck. A flock of large Canada geese slammed into both engines. Within seconds, both engines failed and complete power loss. The cockpit fell silent except for the sound of rushing wind. Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger, a former Air Force pilot with decades of experience, and First Officer Jeff Skiles had only minutes to act. Air traffic control offered options: return to LaGuardia or try Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. But Sully calmly said the words that would echo through history. "We're going to be in the Hudson." With no thrust and limited altitude, Sully guided the A320 over Manhattan, keeping wings level and nose up. The jet skimmed low over the George Washington Bridge before gliding into the icy Hudson River at 150 knots. The impact was violent but controlled, and the aircraft stayed intact and began to float. Within minutes, ferries, police boats, and rescue teams rushed to the scene. Passengers stood on the wings in freezing water, waiting to be pulled to safety. Miraculously, every single person on board survived. Investigators later confirmed that Sully's decision to ditch in the river saved all 155 lives, a feat of judgment, calm, and and precision unmatched in modern aviation. Flight 1549 wasn't just a near disaster. It became a symbol of leadership under pressure, now forever known as the Miracle on the Hudson. On June 10, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390, a BAC 111, took off from Birmingham, England, bound for Malaga, Spain. There were 87 people on board and 81 passengers and 6 crew. Everything seemed routine as the aircraft climbed through, 17,300 feet. Then, without warning, there was a deafening bang. The left cockpit windshield exploded outward, instantly blowing the captain, Tim Lancaster, halfway out of the aircraft. His body was sucked against the fuselage by hurricane-force winds, legs flailing inside the cockpit. The aircraft pitched violently, downward as the cabin, filled with screams and loose debris. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden sprinted into the cockpit and grabbed Lancaster's legs, holding on with all his strength as freezing air and 400 mph winds tore through the flight deck. Another crew member strapped himself into the jump seat and held Nigel in place. The co-pilot, Alistair Atchison, fought to regain control. For 22 terrifying minutes, the aircraft remained in partial control. Passengers braced for impact while the co-pilot managed to descend below 11,000 feet, where oxygen levels were safer. Still gripping his captain's legs, Ogden refused to let go. When the jet finally landed safely at Southampton Airport, rescuers rushed aboard and to everyone's shock, Captain Tim Lancaster was still alive. He suffered frostbite, fractures, and bruising, but miraculously survived the ordeal. Investigators later discovered that the wrong bolts had been installed in the windshield, slightly too small for the frame, causing the glass to fail under cabin pressure. Flight 5390 became one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation, not because of technology, but because of human courage and teamwork under impossible odds. On March 3, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, took off from Paris Orly Airport bound for London Heathrow. On board were 346 people, including families, students, and tourists returning home. Barely 9 minutes after takeoff, disaster struck. At 23,000 feet, the rear cargo door suddenly blew off the aircraft, creating a violent decompression. The floor above the cargo hold collapsed instantly, tearing control cables and severing vital systems. In the cockpit, alarms screamed as the pilots fought to control the massive jet. But the control surfaces were gone. The plane was uncontrollable. Witnesses on the ground saw the DC-10 plummeting through the sky in pieces. At 12:40 p.m., it crashed into the Ermenonville forest outside Paris at nearly 500 miles per hour, killing everyone on board. The wreckage scattered over half a mile, leaving no survivors. The cause was soon uncovered, a design flaw in the cargo door latch system. The door could appear locked even when it wasn't fully secured. This same flaw had already caused a near-fatal incident 2 years earlier, but safety improvements were never enforced. Engineers had warned McDonnell Douglas that the fix was incomplete, yet flights continued. After the crash, new regulations forced airlines worldwide to redesign cargo doors and improve maintenance checks. Flight 981 became one of the deadliest air disasters of its time, a brutal reminder that ignoring warnings can cost hundreds of lives. On the night of May 31, 2009, Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330-203, departed from Rio de Janeiro, bound for Paris. On board were 228 people, passengers and crew, unaware that within a few hours, they would vanish into the Atlantic Ocean. At 10:29 p.m., the flight climbed smoothly to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. As it entered the intertropical convergence zone, massive thunderstorms surrounded the aircraft. Lightning illuminated the clouds as the pilots guided the plane through turbulence. Suddenly, the aircraft's pitot tubes, tiny sensors that measure airspeed, became clogged by ice crystals, causing false readings. The autopilot disconnected and confusion took over the cockpit. Warnings blared, altitude dropped, and the pilots struggled to understand what was happening. The A330 began climbing too steeply, then stalled, losing lift. Despite the engine still running, the aircraft was no longer flying. For 3.5 minutes, the crew fought desperately to regain control in total darkness, unaware they were descending toward the ocean. At 2:14 a.m., Air France Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic, killing everyone on board. The wreckage wasn't found until 2 years later. deep on the ocean floor. Investigators discovered that a combination of sensor failure, lack of training, and human confusion led to the tragedy. It changed aviation forever, leading to better pilot training, sensor redesign, and improved cockpit coordination. Flight 447 became a haunting reminder that even in modern skies, nature and human error can still overpower technology. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, a Boeing 777-200ER, departed from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, bound for Beijing, China. On board were 239 people, passengers and crew. The takeoff was routine with clear skies and calm weather. The plane climbed smoothly to cruising altitude. But about 40 minutes into the flight, all communication with air traffic control suddenly stopped. Radar tracking showed the aircraft deviating sharply from its planned route, heading west across the Malay Peninsula and eventually into the southern Indian Ocean. Despite extensive search operations, no debris was immediately found, creating one of the greatest aviation mysteries of all time. Investigators later discovered parts of the aircraft debris on remote Indian Ocean islands years later. Satellite data suggested the plane ended its flight in a remote stretch of ocean, far from any land. The cause of disappearance remains unknown, though theories include mechanical failure, hijacking, or deliberate action. Flight 370 became a chilling reminder of how even modern aircraft can vanish without a trace, leaving the world with unanswered questions and families searching for closure.